Elliot Oliver Robertson Rodger was born on July 24, 1991, in London, England. He entered the world as the first child of Peter Rodger, a British filmmaker and commercial director, and Leet Chin Rodger, a Malaysian research assistant for a film company. Elliot's early years seemed unremarkable, but behind the surface of a comfortable upbringing lay a childhood marked by emotional struggles, social awkwardness, and a deepening sense of isolation that would follow him into adulthood. From an early age, Elliot's life was touched by creativity and privilege. His father worked in the film industry, eventually gaining recognition as an assistant director on the blockbuster The Hunger Games in 2012. This connection placed Elliot close to Hollywood's glittering world, yet he always felt like an outsider looking in. His mother, Leet Chin, gave him a sense of cultural balance and discipline, but Elliot would later feel estranged even within his own family. At the age of 5, his parents divorced, and this separation would become a defining fracture in his young mind. He split time between his father and mother, developing an increasing feeling that he didn't quite belong anywhere. When Elliot was still a boy, his family relocated from London to the United States, settling in California. This move brought him to the wealthy and sun-soaked neighborhoods of Los Angeles, where luxury cars, celebrity lifestyles, and social cliques defined much of the youth culture. For a shy, sensitive boy like Elliot, the transition was difficult. He struggled to make friends, often preferring solitary activities such as drawing, writing, or playing video games, while his peers easily navigated the social world of sports and school cliques. Elliot often stood on the sidelines, quietly watching but rarely participating. These formative years planted the seeds of the loneliness and resentment that would grow darker with time. By elementary school, Elliot had begun to show signs of social anxiety and awkwardness. Teachers noticed that he rarely spoke up in class, and classmates teased him for his small stature and timid nature. Though he wasn't outright bullied in the extreme sense, he internalized every rejection, every exclusion, as proof that he was fundamentally different. He longed for friendship, but his approach often came across as nervous or forced. When children didn't respond positively, he withdrew further, reinforcing a vicious cycle of isolation. In his own writings years later, Elliot would recall these moments with intense bitterness, viewing even trivial slights as evidence of a cruel and unfair world. Outside of school, Elliot lived a life of relative privilege. His father's career provided access to exclusive circles, including premieres, events, and travel. He had material comforts that many children envied: nice clothes, a safe home, opportunities to experience culture and entertainment. Yet, paradoxically, the more Elliot was surrounded by wealth and status, the more he fixated on his own feelings of inadequacy. He admired the glamorous lifestyles of celebrities and popular classmates, but saw himself as powerless to ever achieve the same respect, attention, or admiration. This toxic mix of envy and self-pity began to define his worldview. During middle school, Elliot's insecurities deepened. His peers began to form relationships, experiment with dating, and explore their identities in a social context. For Elliot, however, adolescence was a period of increasing isolation. He found it nearly impossible to connect with girls, and every rejection, real or imagined, cut him deeply. While other boys boasted about crushes, dances, and early relationships, Elliot remained painfully alone, watching from the outside with growing resentment. This sense of exclusion from the world of teenage romance would later become one of the most prominent themes of his manifesto. Elliot's difficulties extended beyond social life into academics. Though intelligent, he lacked focus and motivation. Teachers noted that he often seemed distracted, lost in daydreams rather than engaged in lessons. His parents, concerned about his lack of progress and increasing withdrawal, sought professional help. Elliot was later diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a developmental disorder on the autism spectrum that affects social interaction and communication. This diagnosis provided some explanation for his struggles, but it also cemented Elliot's belief that he was different in a way that couldn't be fixed. While some children with Asperger's thrive with support, Elliot used it as another reason to wall himself off from others. By the time he reached high school, Elliot's alienation had hardened into a painful reality. He attended several schools, never quite fitting in. At each new environment, he hoped for a fresh start, but the same patterns repeated. His small stature, nervous demeanor, and lack of confidence made him a target for teasing. He longed for acceptance, but his social awkwardness made it nearly impossible to achieve. He wrote in his later manifesto about standing on the edges of social gatherings, watching others connect effortlessly while he stood invisible. This invisibility became intolerable to him, fueling a deep sense of injustice. High school is often remembered as a time of discovery, of forging identities and relationships, but for Elliot it became a crucible of loneliness. He envied the popular boys, who seemed to effortlessly attract friends and girlfriends, resenting them with a burning intensity. He also grew increasingly jealous of women, whom he perceived as cruel gatekeepers who denied him the affection he believed he deserved. These early frustrations hardened into obsessions that would dominate his later life. Yet, not everything in Elliot's teenage years was bleak. He developed a love of fashion, immersing himself in designer brands and personal style as a way to build confidence. He also enjoyed movies, music, and video games, often retreating into fantasy worlds where he could escape the pain of reality. His father's Hollywood connections gave him glimpses into the world of fame and status he so desperately wanted. Though instead of motivating him, these experiences often left him more bitter about his own lack of social success. Still, there were moments where Elliot attempted to break free from his isolation. He joined online communities, explored hobbies, and even tried reaching out to peers. But each failed attempt only reinforced his belief that he was doomed to remain alone. By the end of his teenage years, Elliot carried with him a heavy burden, years of rejection, envy, and a growing sense that life had cheated him out of the happiness he deserved. This was the foundation upon which his dark worldview would be built. A lonely boy who once longed for connection had, through years of rejection and resentment, begun to turn his pain inward and soon outward. The young man who entered adulthood carried with him the seeds of rage that would one day erupt in unspeakable violence. When Elliot Rodger transitioned into his college years, he carried with him all the insecurities, social struggles, and simmering resentments of adolescence. For many young adults, college represents a fresh start, a place to redefine themselves, pursue independence, and explore new relationships. For Elliot, however, it became a magnifying glass that intensified every painful insecurity he had carried since childhood. The University of California, Santa Barbara, and the surrounding community of Isla Vista became the stage where his loneliness and anger would deepen into the dangerous obsessions that ultimately defined his life. Elliot's time at college began with cautious optimism. He was enrolled in Santa Barbara City College, a pathway he hoped would eventually lead him to UC Santa Barbara. His parents supported him financially, providing him with a BMW and a comfortable apartment. Outwardly, he had every advantage: good looks, financial stability, and the opportunity to build a social life in a vibrant college town filled with parties, beaches, and youthful energy. But inside, Elliot remained trapped in the same cycle of fear and resentment that had haunted him since childhood. He arrived in Isla Vista, already burdened with expectations that college would be the place where he finally achieved the friendship, respect, and romantic relationships he had always dreamed of. When reality failed to live up to his fantasies, the disappointment cut even deeper. From his earliest days on campus, Elliot struggled to connect. He attended classes, but rarely engaged with other students. When opportunities for casual conversation or friendships arose, his nervous demeanor and lack of confidence made these moments fleeting. In Isla Vista, social life revolved around parties, fraternities, and dating, worlds Elliot observed from a painful distance. He watched his peers enjoy the freedom of young adulthood, bonding effortlessly and forming romantic connections, while he remained an outsider, invisible once again. Each passing week, his frustration grew. He had expected college to transform his life, but instead, it highlighted everything he believed he lacked. What made matters worse was Isla Vista's culture itself. The seaside community was well known for its nightlife and party atmosphere. Thousands of students filled the streets on weekends, attending loud gatherings, drinking, and celebrating youth. For Elliot, who was deeply introverted and awkward in social settings, this environment was overwhelming. Instead of joining in, he would often sit alone in his car or his apartment, watching others enjoy what he desperately wanted but felt he could never have. These scenes of joy and connection became tormenting reminders of his own loneliness, feeding the bitterness that had begun to consume him. During this period, Elliot started keeping journals. At first, these writings were an outlet for his frustrations, a private place where he could vent his feelings of exclusion and inadequacy. Over time, however, they evolved into something much darker. He began constructing elaborate fantasies of revenge, blending self-pity with resentment toward those he believed had wronged him. In his writings, Elliot described a world divided between those who experienced love, sex, and social acceptance, and those like himself, whom he believed were unfairly denied those pleasures. This black and white view of life left no room for self-reflection. Instead of questioning his own role in his struggles, he blamed society, women, and popular men for his misery. Elliot's fixation on women became particularly toxic. Throughout his college years, he remained a virgin and had no romantic experiences. Each rejection, or even the absence of attention, deepened his rage. He convinced himself that women deliberately ignored him, choosing instead to give affection to men he considered obnoxious brutes. In his mind, women became the gatekeepers of happiness, cruelly denying him the love he felt he deserved. This idea would later dominate his manifesto, but its seeds were planted during these lonely college years. He began to view his life not simply as unlucky, but as part of a grand injustice that demanded retribution. As his resentment grew, Elliot's outward behavior also began to change. Friends and acquaintances described him as increasingly withdrawn, moody, and prone to sudden bursts of anger. Though he occasionally tried to socialize, his attempts often ended in disappointment. When he was rejected or ignored, he internalized the experience as a personal attack. Instead of seeking to improve his social skills or build confidence, he retreated further into isolation, spending hours online or driving aimlessly through Isla Vista, watching others enjoy the life he longed for. Each failed attempt at connection added fuel to the fire of his bitterness. His online activity during this time also played a role in shaping his worldview. Elliot frequented internet forums and communities where discussions of loneliness, rejection, and resentment were common. While some spaces offered support, others fostered toxic beliefs, validating his feelings of victimhood and entitlement. These echo chambers reinforced his idea that society was to blame for his pain. Instead of challenging his perspectives, they gave him language and narratives to express his growing rage. Elliot increasingly saw himself as part of a larger struggle between undesirable men like him and the women and alpha males who supposedly oppressed them. Meanwhile, his academic life deteriorated. Elliot struggled to focus on his studies, often skipping classes or dropping courses altogether. By 2012, he had attempted several times to establish himself in college, but made little progress toward a degree. His parents, growing concerned, encouraged him to seek therapy and support. At various points, Elliot did see mental health professionals, but these encounters failed to address the depth of his issues. He often presented a composed, polite exterior during sessions, downplaying the intensity of his inner rage. As a result, he slipped through the cracks of a system that could have intervened earlier. While Elliot's personal life crumbled, he became increasingly invested in cultivating his appearance. He believed that style and status symbols might help him gain the acceptance he craved. He obsessed over his wardrobe, hair, and image, often spending hours preparing himself before going out. His father's financial support allowed him access to luxury clothing and accessories. But these external improvements did little to change his inner reality. No matter how well dressed or polished he appeared, the rejection and loneliness remained. This dissonance between how he looked and how he felt only deepened his despair. The more Elliot failed to achieve the life he imagined, the more he turned inward to his fantasies. He began drafting what would later become his infamous Manifesto, My Twisted World. In these early writings, he outlined the story of his life as he saw it, a narrative of unfair rejection, suffering, and longing for revenge. What started as private reflections evolved into a blueprint of his worldview, filled with self, justification, and rage. By framing his life as a tragic tale inflicted upon him by others, Elliot absolved himself of responsibility, positioning himself as both victim and avenger. This dangerous mindset grew steadily during his years in Isla Vista, hardening into the ideology that would eventually fuel his violent actions. By the end of his college years, Elliot was no longer just a lonely young man struggling to fit in. He had become a ticking time bomb, consumed by envy, resentment, and fantasies of retribution. His failed attempts at friendship, his growing hatred toward women, and his obsession with social status all combined into a toxic cocktail. The journals he kept during this period, filled with bitterness and self-pity, would later be published as a chilling testament to his descent. In Isla Vista, surrounded by thousands of students experiencing the vibrant freedom of youth, Elliot Rodger found himself utterly alone. The gap between his desires and his reality grew into an unbearable void, and instead of seeking healing or change, he began to imagine a dark solution. If he could not join the world of happiness, he would take revenge upon it. By the time Elliot Rodger reached his early 20s, his loneliness had hardened into something darker, more calculated, and far more dangerous. What began as private frustrations and diary entries transformed into an extensive written document that would become infamous around the world. His manifesto, which he titled My Twisted World, this sprawling 137-page narrative was not just a collection of personal reflections, but a carefully constructed life story, written to explain, justify, and glorify the path he believed he was destined to follow. It was, in his mind, both a confession and a declaration, a chronicle of his suffering and a roadmap to what he ominously called the Day of Retribution. Elliot began writing the manifesto in earnest during the later years of his failed college life. Isolated in his Isla Vista apartment, he spent countless hours recounting his childhood, teenage years, and college disappointments. Every slight, every rejection, every lonely night was cataloged with obsessive detail. To Elliot, these experiences were not just the struggles of a socially awkward young man, but evidence of a world that had conspired against him. In My Twisted World, he painted himself as the protagonist of a tragic story, a gentleman who was denied the pleasures of love, sex, and friendship by a cruel and unfair society. The manifesto is divided into 3 parts: his childhood, his teenage years, and his college life, culminating in his plans for violent retribution. Elliot wrote with a tone of superiority, often describing himself as destined for greatness, too intelligent and refined to be overlooked. Yet, he constantly returned to the same grievance, that women had rejected him, and that men he viewed as inferior were rewarded with the affection he believed was his birthright. This contradiction, his simultaneous self-glorification and deep insecurity, runs through every page. For Elliot, My Twisted World was not simply about documenting his past. It was about constructing a narrative that positioned him as both victim and avenger. He wrote of women as objects who had collectively wronged him, and of men as rivals who had stolen what he believed should have been his. He envisioned himself as a revolutionary figure, someone who would punish society for excluding him. In his words, the day of retribution would be the moment he reclaimed power by inflicting suffering on those who had made him suffer. The manifesto is chilling in its detail. Elliot outlined his fantasies of revenge against women, imagining scenarios where he would imprison them, starve them, or eradicate them entirely. He expressed admiration for violent figures of the past, and he fantasized about a future society where men like him would be celebrated, while women would be stripped of their freedom. His writings revealed a deep misogyny that went beyond personal rejection. It was a worldview that cast women as the root of all his unhappiness, and therefore the rightful targets of his rage. But My Twisted World also reveals the fragile psyche beneath the hatred. Elliot often slipped into passages of despair, admitting to feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. He longed for affection and intimacy, yet his worldview made it impossible to see women as human beings with agency. Instead, he saw them as prizes to be won or denied, and when he could not attain them, he blamed them for his misery. The manifesto became a window into the mind of a young man trapped in a cycle of entitlement, envy, and rage. Alongside his writing, Elliot began to plan. The day of retribution, as he called it, was to be his grand finale. The moment he would unleash his fury on the world and make his name known. His plans were not impulsive but deliberate. He acquired firearms legally, purchasing 3 semi-automatic handguns over the course of several months. He stockpiled ammunition and practiced at shooting ranges, honing the skills he intended to use in his final act. He also considered other methods of mass harm, including knives and even the idea of using his car as a weapon. To Elliot, this was not just an attack. It was a performance, the ultimate expression of the story he had written about himself. In the weeks leading up to his attack, Elliot's behavior grew increasingly alarming to those around him, though no one realized the full extent of his plans. He withdrew further from social contact, spending hours alone. He uploaded YouTube videos where he spoke directly to the camera, delivering monologues that echoed the themes of his manifesto. In these videos, he addressed women with anger and bitterness, accusing them of ignoring him and declaring that he would have his revenge. His final video, titled Elliot Rodger's Retribution, was uploaded just hours before his attack. In it, he sat in his car, dressed in a button-down shirt, and calmly explained his intentions. He spoke of how he had been denied love and sex, how he had suffered in loneliness, and how he would punish the world for the happiness it had denied him. With a chilling calmness, he announced that the time for retribution had come. The combination of his manifesto and his videos painted a terrifying picture of a young man consumed by entitlement and rage. But perhaps what made it most disturbing was how articulate and composed Elliot appeared. He was not ranting incoherently. He was deliberate, rehearsed, and chillingly certain of his mission. To him, the day of retribution was not just violence, it was justice. A final act that would make the world recognize his suffering. Despite the clarity of his writings and videos, Elliot still maintained a facade of normalcy to those who interacted with him casually. His parents, increasingly worried about his mental state, tried to intervene. Just weeks before the attack, his mother found his disturbing videos online and alerted authorities. Sheriff's deputies visited Elliot's apartment to perform a welfare check, but he presented himself politely, insisting everything was fine. He did not reveal his true intentions, and the deputies left without searching his home or probing deeper. Hidden inside his room at that very moment were the weapons and writings that laid out his plan. The chance to stop him had come and gone. Elliot's manifesto ends with a clear declaration of his intentions. He described how he would target a sorority house near the UC Santa Barbara campus, where he believed women would be gathered. He fantasized about slaughtering them as punishment for the years of rejection he had endured. He then outlined a broader rampage, during which he would attack men and women alike before ultimately taking his own life. The document, along with his videos, served as both confession and justification, ensuring that even after his death, his story would be known. By May of 2014, Elliot Rodger was no longer just a lonely young man consumed by bitterness. He had transformed himself into a self-styled avenger, armed with weapons, fueled by hate, and determined to leave a legacy written in blood. My Twisted World was not just the diary of a troubled individual. It was a chilling manifesto of entitlement, resentment, and violence, and it marked the point of no return. The day of retribution was no longer just an idea. It was coming, and nothing would stop him. May 23, 2014, began like any other day in Isla Vista. The coastal community buzzed with the usual energy of a college town. Students attending classes, preparing for the weekend, and crowding the streets near the University of California, Santa Barbara. But for Elliot Rodger, this was not just another day. It was the culmination of years of resentment, isolation, and planning. In his mind, this day would be remembered forever as the day of retribution. Well, Elliot woke up that morning with a chilling sense of purpose. In his apartment on Seville Road, his weapons were already prepared. 3 legally purchased semi-automatic handguns, a Glock 34, a Sig Sauer P226, and a Walther P22, along with hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He had meticulously organized his plan, knowing exactly how he wanted the day to unfold. Before carrying out his attack, he finalized his writings and uploaded his final YouTube video, Elliot Rodger's Retribution, where he calmly explained his motives and intentions. Dressed neatly, as if preparing for a performance, he declared to the world that society had wronged him and that he would make everyone pay the price. The attack began in the early evening inside his own apartment. His first victims were his 3 roommates, Cheng Yuan Hong, George Chen, and Waiyan Wang. Elliot had grown increasingly hostile toward them in the months leading up to the massacre. In his manifesto, he expressed resentment that they enjoyed social lives he felt excluded from. On May 23, he ambushed them one by one. Armed with knives, he brutally stabbed and killed all 3 men. It was a calculated and frenzied act of violence, and their deaths marked the beginning of his rampage. After killing his roommates, Elliot left his apartment and set out in his black BMW. His next target was a nearby sorority house, Alpha Phi, which he had long fixated upon. In his manifesto, he described his fantasies of punishing the women there, whom he believed embodied the rejection he had endured throughout his life. Shortly before 9:30 p.m., Elliot arrived at the Alpha Phi house. He knocked on the door, intending to force his way inside and kill as many women as possible. But the door remained locked, and no one opened it. Frustrated, he pulled out his handgun and began firing at students outside the building. 2 young women, Catherine Cooper and Veronica Weiss, both 22 years old, were shot and killed near the sorority house. A 3rd woman was wounded but survived. These attacks stunned the quiet neighborhood, sending students fleeing in panic. Elliot then returned to his car and continued his spree, driving through the streets of Isla Vista while firing at pedestrians, cyclists, and anyone who crossed his path. As chaos erupted, Elliot drove to a nearby Delay on Pardal Road, one of the busiest streets in Isla Vista. There, he exited his car briefly and opened fire inside the store. 20-year-old Christopher Michaels Martinez, a UCSB student, was struck by gunfire and killed. The Delay shooting added to the confusion and terror as witnesses scrambled for cover and called 911. By now, police had been alerted and were rushing toward the scene. What followed was a chilling 10-minute rampage across Isla Vista. Elliot weaved through the streets in his BMW, firing randomly at pedestrians, cyclists, and cars. He struck several people with his vehicle, using it as a weapon alongside his firearms. At least 14 people were wounded in this chaotic spree, some by bullets, others by the force of his speeding car. Witnesses described the scene as surreal, students running in all directions, sirens blaring, and gunfire echoing through the night. Police quickly identified Elliot's car and engaged him in multiple shootouts as he sped through town. At least 2 separate gunfights took place between Elliot and responding officers. Though he was struck by gunfire, Elliot managed to continue driving, wounded but still determined to carry out his plan. His path of destruction only ended when he crashed his BMW into a parked car near Del Playa Drive. When officers approached the vehicle, they found Elliot Rodger dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The massacre had lasted just minutes, but the toll was devastating. 6 people were murdered, 14 others injured, and countless students traumatized by the violence they had witnessed. The killer's weapons and writings left behind revealed the extent of his preparation and the depth of his hatred. The timeline of the Isla Vista Massacre paints a portrait of both brutality and meticulous planning. Elliot's first murders, committed with knives in the privacy of his apartment, showed his cold determination. His attack on the sorority house revealed his obsession with punishing women. Even though he failed to enter the building as he had fantasized, his random shootings throughout Isla Vista reflected his desire to inflict widespread suffering, ensuring that his rage was felt by as many as possible. The combination of firearms, vehicle assaults, and calculated movement made the rampage especially chaotic and terrifying. For survivors and witnesses, the night remains unforgettable. Students who had been studying, eating, or walking home suddenly found themselves in the middle of a massacre. Some described hearing the shots and initially thinking they were fireworks, only to realize with horror that people were falling to the ground. Others recalled the sound of Elliot's car engine as he sped down the streets, deliberately swerving toward pedestrians. The sheer randomness of the violence made it even more terrifying. No one knew where he would strike next. In the aftermath, first responders and law enforcement worked quickly to secure the scene and treat the wounded. Paramedics rushed victims to local hospitals while police searched Elliot's apartment. Inside, they discovered the bodies of his 3 roommates, confirming that the massacre had begun hours earlier. They also found his manifesto, My Twisted World, along with his video recordings, which left no doubt about his intentions. News of the killings spread rapidly across the country. By the following morning, headlines everywhere carried the story of the Isla Vista Massacre, with Elliot Rodger's name and face plastered across television screens and newspapers. His final video, uploaded just before the attack, circulated online, horrifying viewers with its calm yet hateful tone. The discovery of his manifesto added even more shock, revealing the twisted logic behind the killings. The massacre ended with Elliot's death, but the scars it left on Isla Vista were deep. Families of the victims, survivors, and the entire UCSB community were left grappling with the senselessness of the violence. The timeline of that night became a grim sequence etched into memory. A series of moments when ordinary life was shattered by an individual consumed by hatred and delusion. For Elliot, May 23, 2014 was the day of retribution. But for the world, it became a day of mourning, confusion, and reflection on how a young man's descent into isolation and misogyny could culminate in such devastating tragedy. The Isla Vista Massacre was over, but the questions it raised about mental health, misogyny, gun access, and societal failures were only just beginning. In the hours following the Isla Vista Massacre, the small coastal community descended into shock and grief. Sirens had faded, the gunfire had ended, but the echoes of violence lingered everywhere. Students who had been running for their lives now gathered in silence, their faces lit by flashing police lights. Families of victims rushed to hospitals or received devastating phone calls that their loved ones would never be coming home. 6 lives had been stolen, 14 others had been injured, and hundreds more had been left traumatized by the horror they had witnessed. Authorities quickly moved to piece together the events of the night. The crime scene stretched across multiple blocks in Isla Vista, with bloodstains on sidewalks, shattered glass in the streets, and bullet holes in storefronts. Elliot Rodger's black BMW, crumpled from its final crash, became a symbol of the chaos he had unleashed. Inside the vehicle, investigators found the gun with which he had taken his own life, along with hundreds of unused rounds of ammunition. Elliot Rodger's story is not just about one man's descent into violence. It is about the systems, cultures, and ideologies that allowed his hatred to grow and spread even after his death. The cultural impact of his actions continues to reverberate. Every new discussion about mass violence, incels, or gender-based hate crimes eventually circles back to Isla Vista. Elliot Rodger wanted to be a symbol, and tragically, he succeeded, not in the way he envisioned, but as a grim reminder of what happens when isolation turns to rage, and rage finds validation in the darkest corners of the internet. The Isla Vista Massacre ended in bloodshed on May 23, 2014, but the questions it raised continue to shape conversations about violence, gender, mental health, and society. Elliot Rodger's actions left scars not only on the families of his victims and the University of California, Santa Barbara community, but on the cultural and political landscape of the United States. His legacy is not measured in admiration, though some extremist groups have tried to grant him that status, but in the lessons his case forces us to confront. Lessons about prevention, responsibility, and the dangerous ideologies festering in our midst. In the immediate aftermath, policymakers, activists, and grieving families turned their grief into demands for change. Richard Martinez, the father of victim Christopher Michaels, Martinez, gave a speech that reverberated far beyond Isla Vista. Through tears of anguish and fury, he demanded accountability, shouting, "When will this insanity stop? Not one more." His words became a rallying cry, spreading across social media and political campaigns as a plea for stronger gun laws and more robust background checks. The hashtag Not No More trended worldwide, reflecting the collective desire to prevent another tragedy like Isla Vista. Legislatively, the massacre led to tangible reforms. In California, lawmakers passed bills aimed at keeping firearms out of the hands of individuals deemed a threat. Among the most significant was the creation of the Gun Violence Restraining Order, also known as a red flag law. This policy allows family members or law enforcement to petition courts to temporarily remove firearms from individuals who pose a danger to themselves or others. The law directly addressed one of the key failures in Rodger's case: the welfare check that ended without deputies discovering the weapons he had stockpiled. Red flag laws have since spread to numerous states, becoming one of the most widely discussed policy responses to gun violence in America. But even as legal reforms took shape, deeper cultural questions lingered. Elliot Rodger's Manifesto was not only a personal account of loneliness and resentment. It was a manifesto of entitlement, a belief that women owed him affection and intimacy simply because he desired it. His rage was not just against individuals who had rejected him, but against the very notion of women exercising autonomy. In this sense, the Isla Vista Massacre forced society to confront the deadly consequences of misogyny. It showed that the attitudes often dismissed as harmless bitterness or just internet talk could, in fact, escalate into mass murder. For many feminists and scholars, Rodger's actions underscored the importance of addressing toxic masculinity, the cultural norms that teach men to equate self-worth with dominance, sexual conquest, and external validation. His life story reflected how isolation and insecurity, when combined with those toxic beliefs, could become combustible. The tragedy sparked new conversations about educating young men on healthy relationships, consent, and emotional resilience. It also highlighted the need to listen when men express struggles with loneliness and identity, not to excuse their behavior, but to provide interventions before despair metastasizes into hatred. Mental health professionals also wrestled with the implications of Rodger's case. His parents had sought therapy for him, and he had been under psychiatric care at various points. Yet none of these interventions were enough to stop his descent. His ability to mask his intentions during police encounters demonstrated how challenging it can be to identify dangerous individuals, even when red flags exist. This led to renewed emphasis on improving mental health services for young adults, especially in college communities where isolation can be acute. It also fueled debates about patient confidentiality and public safety, how far authorities should go in breaching privacy when warning signs are present. The legacy of Elliot Rodger also endures in the digital world. His name became synonymous with the Incel movement, which continues to radicalize some men online. The glorification of Rodger by certain extremist groups remains one of the most unsettling aspects of his story. It raises uncomfortable questions about the role of internet platforms in enabling hate speech, misogyny, and radicalization. While many companies have since cracked down on incel forums, these communities continue to reappear, adapting to new spaces and languages. The persistence of Rodger's influence shows that combating extremism is not simply a matter of shutting down websites. It requires addressing the underlying grievances and ideologies that fuel such movements. Academics, journalists, and artists have continued to grapple with the meaning of Isla Vista. Documentaries, essays, and books examine the massacre as both a personal tragedy and a societal failure. Some portray it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring warning signs. Others view it as a symbol of systemic misogyny and the need for cultural change. In classrooms, Rodger's Manifesto is studied not as literature, but as evidence, a disturbing case study in how personal resentment can evolve into extremist ideology. For the families of the victims, however, the legacy is not abstract. It is not about ideology or cultural shifts. It is about empty chairs at dinner tables, birthdays that will never be celebrated, and futures stolen by one man's rage. Catherine Cooper and Veronica Wace were remembered as vibrant, ambitious women who lit up every room they entered. Christopher Michaels Martinez was a compassionate and driven student with dreams of becoming a lawyer. Cheng Yuan Hong, George Chen, and Weihang Wang were hardworking young men, friends and roommates whose lives were cut brutally short. Their stories are the true legacy of Isla Vista, the reminder that behind every statistic are human beings with families, dreams, and love. As time passes, the Isla Vista Massacre remains a pivotal moment in America's struggle with mass violence. It represents a convergence of issues: gun access, mental health, misogyny, and online radicalization that continue to haunt society. Each new act of violence that references Rodger underscores the need to learn from his case, not to sensationalize him, but to recognize the warning signs and confront the cultural currents that enabled him. In the end, Elliot Rodger wanted to be remembered. He believed his day of retribution would make him famous, that the world would finally acknowledge his superiority. And indeed, his name lives on, but not in the way he imagined. He is remembered as a killer, as a symbol of hate and entitlement, and as a reminder of how dangerous resentment can become when it festers unchecked. The true legacy of Isla Vista, however, belongs to the victims and the movements born from their loss. Not one more continues to echo as a demand for change, a refusal to accept the status quo of violence. The massacre forces us to confront hard questions, but it also challenges us to build a society where tragedies like this are no longer inevitable. The story of Elliot Rodger is not just the story of a mass murderer. It is the story of a society reckoning with itself. A society forced to ask, how do we address loneliness without allowing it to turn into hate? How do we protect the vulnerable without stigmatizing them? How do we ensure that no parent has to stand before cameras, grieving, shouting, "Not one more"? There are no easy answers, but remembering Isla Vista, not just the killer, but the lives he stole, keeps those questions alive. And in that remembrance lies the possibility of change.